Thank you, everybody, and thank you for your patience as you just finalizing the last setup details. Welcome to the LIDNUG user group's monthly presentation. Tonight, as you may have noticed, we have John Papa doing HTML and JavaScript apps with MVVM and KnockoutJS. John Papa is a civil expert and a master regional director, and has also authored several Pluralsight courses. They're definitely worth having a look at. Tonight we will also be giving out a couple of weekly subscriptions to Pluralsight and a couple of monthly subscriptions as well. So there will be 4 of those giving away. Before we continue, just a big thank you to Orcrec, Telluric, Safari Books Online, and Pluralsight for their continuous support of the LIDNUG group. Without these guys' support, we just couldn't do what we do these days. And upcoming events, we have on April the 3rd, we have Arto Laxberg, and he's going to be doing either asynchronous programming in C++ using Parallel Pattern Library, or what's new in Visual Studio 11 for native code developers. Then on April the 11th, we have Scott Guthrie with his 11th presentation on his open unplugged Q&A. On April the 27th, we have Patrick Dussard, also known as the father of CLR. May 10th, we have Phil Wheat doing lots of Xbox Connect development. So as you can see, we have quite a number of events coming up. Last but not least, some of the details, our calendar, smarturl.it/LIDNUG, eventbot, also lidnugevents.eventbot.com. All of our events are recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So feel free to watch them up there if you're having issues. Also, thank you to the LIDNUG team for all their help and for making these events a possibility. So, thank you, John. This is your second time here. Thank you for taking your time out and coming back and presenting to us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome.
Are we still on the air? It sounded like we just lost some reception. Cool. Okay, so I think everybody can hear me here. If you have a problem, just let me know. My name is John Papa, and what I'm going to do is take you through kind of a whirlwind tour of KnockoutJS. Your telephone is ringing, unfortunately. So basically what this session is going to be about is going to be a whirlwind tour of how you can use Knockout JavaScript and MVVM styles to build web applications today. And kind of the idea behind this session is if you're doing a lot of web development and you're trying to figure out kind of where to head, one of the nice things about Knockout is it'll let you bring in things like data binding and dependencies and build that MVVM style architecture and patterns into your web apps that a lot of people love with things like WPF and Silverlight. It's one of the things that attracted me to it as well. So when I first got into JavaScript many, many years ago, over 10 years ago, when I still had hair, things were a little bit more of a mess. We didn't have jQuery. We didn't really have good CSS at all. CSS was really not anything you wanted to speak about. And the patterns really weren't out there. It was basically just a lot of JavaScript function spaghetti code. And things have changed dramatically over the last decade, as you would expect in the web world. So bringing a lot of these different things together, we can really have a really robust type of app. And that's what I'm going to try to show you today is different ways you can use Knockout. It's just one of the pieces of the puzzle. It's not everything, but it's one of the pieces of the puzzle of building really good web apps. So starting out here, if I can get the slides to move. There we go. Everything you're going to see in today's agenda is actually available in my Pluralsight course as well, which is the JavaScript apps with MVVM and Knockout. And I think we actually have the wrong deck uploaded here. So let me see if I can get the right deck. If not, we'll just kind of wing it. So we're going to talk about a couple things here. We're going to talk about how you can build apps using Knockout with and without Knockout. So first, before I talk about how to use Knockout, I'd like to show you what the alternatives are. So if you don't use Knockout, what would you be normally doing? I'd like to set the tone with that. And then we'll get into different types of observables. And this is how the data mining works. Basically, you've got observable properties, you've got observable arrays, and then you've got custom observables that you can deal with. And then how do you bind these observables to the client itself inside your HTML? Now we'll talk about templating and how that works, because templating is built into Knockout. It's one of the native features that you get with Knockout, although you can use external templating engines such as jQuery templates, or in the future something like JS Render, or even now Underscore. And then some more advanced stuff where what happens when you kind of get stuck and you need to go beyond the scope of the basics of Knockout and you need to do something a little more complicated. Well, you can create your own custom bindings using custom binding handlers, and they can pretty much do anything you want. It's a way you can inject your own code. Think of it as kind of like if you're familiar with Silverlight or Blend or Windows 8 Metro, think of it like a behavior on steroids. So with that, starting out, we've got the state of JavaScript development today. Everybody who does a lot of enterprise-type development, or even just any patterns, if you're into like solid principles, you really think about separation of concerns. We like to have different things separated out on their own. So you want your structure and your behavior and your presentation to be split out. Or if you're building some kind of a class, you really want your functionality in that class to really do one thing. Well, in JavaScript right now, you've got your separation of concerns, which is one thing to deal with. You've got your UI patterns that you want to implement. Maybe you're doing things with jQuery UI, or you're using Bootstrap for Twitter, or you're doing some other kind of UI patterns with CSS. Or maybe you're doing MVVM and you're trying to implement your JavaScript with some kind of a pattern. And then how do you do a structured JavaScript? Do you just do a lot of functions, or are you using some kind of pattern, like a revealing module pattern or something else? Or do you just want to kind of spit out your JavaScript as you go? What should you pay attention to? What's important? And then how do you deal with binding data? Are you pulling and pushing data in from different data sources and pulling them up to your screen and then sucking them back out into objects? How does that work? Well, in the state of JavaScript today, this is kind of a big puzzle, and one of the nice things about Knockout is it kind of puts these different pieces together into a simple, organized structure. So what is Knockout? Knockout is simply a tool that allows you to have rich client-side interactivity. It's an MVVM-like pattern that helps implement. Well, you don't have to do it that way, but it helps you. And it's got very wide browser support. So we can support IE6, Chrome, Firefox, Opera, and there's a couple other browsers I'm going to show today as well. So first, what is Knockout in 3 steps? First thing you're going to do is implement a declarative data binding structure. And a declarative data binding structure is going to be using the data-bind syntax, which is HTML5 compliant. It's an attribute you can use, data dash, and then anything. So data bind is something Knockout looks for, and it says 2 things inside there. What are you going to bind to that you're binding, and then what value you're going to bind to it. So in this case, I'm binding the value of the input, and I'm going to bind it to some property called first name. It's just like Silverlight or XAML, it doesn't know where first name is coming from. You're going to tell it that later. So that's your target. And your source, in this case, is some variable you call myViewModel. You have created an object with a property called first name. And instead of just giving it the value John, I'm actually giving it a ko.observable. Ko is the prefix for the namespace for Knockout. So you say, give me an observable, its value is going to be John. And therefore, the first name is going to get bound up there. And the way you wire them together, kind of the way you did your data binding structure, is you say Knockout.apply bindings, myViewModel. Now, a lot of people get hung up here at this point. They try to apply the bindings every time something changes. You don't have to do that. Once you call apply bindings, what actually happens is Knockout goes through your DOM, or whatever you've bound it to, and it looks for any elements that have a data bind attribute. And then it takes your view model, in this case the myViewModel, and it looks and it binds up all the values to it. So now anytime something changes in any of these properties in the source or up in the target in the inputs, Knockout's going to reflect that change. So we can take a look at how that works in a fill, but we'll jump over one more step. And then we'll take a look at 2 demos at once. So how do you do it without Knockout? If you wanted to not use Knockout, the way you have to pull data values out of your source into your target elements is you write something on jQuery. And then you have to pull them back out of your elements into your source object again. So you have to push elements into the screen and pull them back out. Not a big deal if you got 1 or 2 elements like I just showed the first name. But when you've got a screen that's got 30 or 40 elements in it, and you've got to push them up and push them down, that could be about 80 lines of code. Excuse me, and jQuery can certainly assist you here as opposed to just using raw JavaScript. And then what about notifications? What happens when something changes? What if you want to bind yourself to a particular change notification? You can actually subscribe to notifications with Knockout. With jQuery, you'd have to do that all yourself. So it's not that you can't do it, but the code might look something like this. You might have like a guitar model and a sales price, and here's just some regular HTML elements. And then you have some source object, which just has some properties in it. And then you could write some jQuery that says, go find the guitar model and put in the value of the product model. And go find the sales price and stick the value with the sales price. So this works, but what's the problem? The problem is that now when somebody changes those values and they press save on the screen, those values are not going to be put back into the source object. You have to write more jQuery to actually pull it back out. Also, if something changes in the source object, it's not going to be reflected up on the screen, so you're not getting that true data binding. So you're kind of getting a one-way push doing it this way. And of course, you could write a lot of code to do it yourself, but that's kind of where Knockout shines. So let's take a look at how we can use with and without Knockout. Here, I'm going to flip over to my desktop. And the first demo, we're going to take a look at how we run things with and without Knockout. And I don't mean to run Camtasia, sorry about that. I'll run my browser. And here's my browser over here. There we go. So the first demo, it doesn't look so sexy, but what we're doing up here is we're writing some code on the top without using Knockout. We've got an item number and a guitar model and a sales price. When I change the guitar model from a Taylor to a Martin, it's not actually going to change the underlying object. However, with Knockout, with observables, I can actually change these values. So what I'm going to do here, close down here, coming inside my code for this page, what we're going to do is look at how we do this without Knockout, which is right here. And you can see I've just got some spans and some elements. And then I have a jQuery file, sorry, I have a JavaScript file up here, where I've got my object. And then right here, I'm just pushing these values into the elements. So it's saying, using jQuery, go find the ID that matches guitar item number, and push the value from product item number into it. And that product item number is right there. With Knockout, though, what I'm doing is saying, all right, I've got this item number. Now say data bind, set the text to be item number. And that's text because it's a span and it's read only. And this one's an input, it's a text box. And I'm saying set the data binding for the value of that text box to be model. For the value of this text box to be sales price. So Knockout will push the values up to the screen and pull them back down as well. And I think we had a demo for the basic Knockout. Let me go ahead and open that one up real quick into a browser. This is a public JS fiddle that you can run if you like. And let's see if I can make this a little bigger. There we go. So here's a very simple Knockout example up at this JS fiddle. Here we've got an input where the value is first name and the text is first name. So you can see I've got an input box and I've got the value down here. When I change John to Brian and I tab out of the field, it updates both values for me. And that's simply doing a view model here and applying the bindings. It doesn't get any simpler than this. So if you want that fiddle, that'll be in the deck that you can download as well. All right, let's flip back over to the presentation. And if I can find it. So that's kind of the life with and without Knockout version. And the next step we're going to look at is observables. So we talked about how these observables work and showed a simple example. But let's take a look at this with different kinds of observables and what actually happens under the covers. So first, when I have the source object, we've got like a Taylor 110. And when you do the binding, it's going to load it up into the screen into your HTML element. Then if the user changes that value to a different value, like Taylor 914 CE, it's then going to also push it back into the source object for you. So Knockout does all that for you. It gives you that two-way binding update by using an observable property. And then the declarative binding for that, we just simply say the data bind, and then we can set up observables any way we like down here. Now, it's worth pointing out you don't have to use a ko.observable. If you don't want the property to go both ways in the binding, you don't need to do that. But if you want the bindings to go both directions, you need to make it a ko observable, not just a POCO. So let's take a look at that demo in succession with the other one. We'll do two in a row here. So I don't have to flip back and forth too much for you. So another type of observable is called a computed observable. And the canonical example here is take first name and last name and you make a full name property. So when observables change, any observable that's used to make this computed, it's going to reflect that change up into the target UI. Now one thing is with computed is you have to manage the keyword this. Like anything in JavaScript, it gets a little complicated, and I can show you some tips on that. If you've used older versions of Knockout, the computed was formerly known as dependent observable. It's now known as computed. And the way this works is you might have a view model up here with ID, sales price, and quantity. Now let's say you wanted to create an extended price where it's simply the sales price times the quantity. Well, what you can do is create an extended price property, then use the KO computed function to define that what this is going to be is get the product, and if it exists, we're going to go ahead and calculate the sales price times the quantity. And that's going to make this all work. So the sales price times quantity, we got a little bit of checking here to make sure there's actually a number. And then the final check down there is the VM. This VM property, that is called the owner. This is a second parameter computed. This owner, whatever it is going to be represented by the this keyword inside of the function. So this is always represented by something else in JavaScript. If you want to clarify and make sure that the this keyword is what you think it is, in this case I want it to be the view model, I pass in the view model as a parameter, and then this represents that. So let's take a look at how the computeds and the observables work. We'll flip back to the desktop. Here we have an example of an observable. And here we've got an object at the top, which is just regular FOCO, and then one at the bottom, which is using observables. So I create product 1 and product 2. Same values in them, just one uses observables and one does not. And I'm applying the data bindings. And then inside of my HTML, I'm actually using data binding syntax for all of them. So the syntax is exactly the same. The first one's up here where it's using product 1. Those are not using observables. And the ones down here for product 2 are using observables. And we should be able to see a difference in how this behaves. So when we run this, you can see the example up here. Now the top one is just using an object literal with no observables. And I can change the Taylor to Martin, and nothing is changing. You can see the same value, the old value is down there. So this is the problem that gets represented if you don't use an observable. I change the value as a user, but I have not yet pushed the value down to the JSON object. But here, if I change this observable to something, let's say like, I don't know, the Papa guitar. Notice when I did that, this value down here changed. Now let's make the sales price $7, because I don't make very good guitars. So down here the values get represented. Now with Knockout, the only difference is I've used the property as a type observable. So therefore the properties go back and forth. It's two-way data binding for me. The computer observables here, we can make this a little bigger. We've got a unit price and the quantity, and it calculates the extended price with no formatting. As soon as I change this unit price to like, I don't know, $25, notice the extended price is changing as I go. So that's as I type it. It's actually changing and recalculating. That's because any time a observable property that's inside of a computed changes, it's going to notify that computed and say, recalculate yourself. So if we look at the source code for that again, we look at that computed down here. Where is the computed? Where is the, oh, I'm on the wrong page. It helps when you look at the right page. So if we come down here and we look at the computed property of extended price, here we've got extended price. It's a computed function. Anything inside of this function, which starts here, and is all in the highlighted area, anything inside of it that's an observable, if it changes, this computer is going to recalculate itself and return the product. So in this case, if the quantity changes or the product or the sales price changes, it's going to reflect that by changing the extended price for me. And this is where the VM is really important. I pass in this owner property, and that's what's going to represent this. If I omit this parameter, I could have some problems. And one way to show that is by opening the debugging tools. And down here, I can put a debugger on my script. And unfortunately, I don't think I can increase this font. But what I can do is I can set the property down there to show what happens when I refresh this page. Inside of Chrome's debugger, I can see the value of this is actually my view model. And it's got a product in it, and it's got a quantity. And in that product, I've got sorts of properties in there too. So I could actually go to the console window, and I could say this product. Oops, I think it's product. There's my product. And I can examine there's a photo URL, sales price, and short description. Now, if I change this code, let's stop that page, and I go over here and I get rid of my view model. Let's see what happens to this time. Let's go ahead and breakpoint. We'll refresh the page. Oops, I think I took the breakpoint off. Now I've got an error, uncaught error. The DOM window has no product. So let's scroll that up. You can see that here. What's happening now is I'm inside of this method. I'm going to refresh. And before I even get there, it's going to break. So let's refresh again. Now I'm inside the computer function, and this is now the DOM window, which is not what I want. So it's really important when you're using observables, computer observables, that you make sure that you set that this property. So flipping it back over to our sample here, this right here is kind of the key. And one of the things I run into a lot when I rate these computers, I forget to put that in, and then later on I remember and I have to go back and put it there because the code won't work otherwise. So let's go back to the presentation and we'll take a look at the next section. So we've seen two kinds of observables that you can create. Another kind is an observable array. So a lot of times you'll have a list of objects, and just like in Silverlight or XAML, you have an observable collection. The observable array will track the state of the objects, how many objects are in the array, not the state of each individual object. Which means that when items are added or removed, the array is sending notifications, not when the objects themselves are being changed. So if you want to track the actual objects, you want to use observables for those as well. So the way this works is you set up an object, and here I've got the products property, which is a type observable array, and I just stick an array in there. Now one key thing to notice about this is the properties inside of the observable array are not observables. So if I wanted these values to have two-way data binding, I'd have to make them observables too. But because this is just going to be a read-only list, I don't have to bother. I just want the values to go to the screen. And then the way you can look at that is say, here's a span. I can actually operate on the observable products. And it's actually a function, if you remember. It's got parentheses around the observable array. So it's a products function.length of how many items are in there. So another thing we'll look at is built-in bindings. I've mentioned a couple bindings so far, like text and value. Those are the most common ones you'll see. But you'll see a lot of built-in bindings in Knockout. And you can actually separate multiple ones with commas. So for example, you could say, here's an enable and a value binding. The enable binding does exactly what you think. It enables or disables based upon the value that you bind to it. So here we're going to enable this text box if this property is true. If it's false, it won't be. And actually more correctly is if this property is truthy or falsy, which in JavaScript world, a truthful value is anything that's not false or null or not a number, etc. Anything's truthful is basically any value. And then here the value is going to be sales price. And we just separate these by commas. And you can have a whole series of data bindings in here. You'll see down here with the select list, the options are being bound to an array called colors. The value is going to be the selected color. That's the value that gets selected. And then I'm going to get the options text from the property called name inside the colors array. And the options value from the property called key inside the colors array. There's a whole slew of built-in bindings. And these are most of them right here. And I'll go through with some of the more popular ones. So the first ones we'll look at are the clicks. So if you want to operate on some kind of a button or clicking a screen or a span or a div, or if you want to do a mouse over, you can use click or event. So click is great for actually clicking, and event will let you aware of any event that the browser can listen for. Another one is state. So you've got disable and enable. And to be very honest with you, I only use enable. I get a little confused when I do disables. It's kind of like having a double negative in there. So I only use enable. And there's also visible, which basically just toggles things on and off. Yes, you can do this with CSF. Yes, you can do it with jQuery as well. But this is a nice way through a binding. You don't have to write any code. You can just disable or enable something based upon the state of the value. Text and value bindings we saw. Text for basically showing read-only text, like in stands, values for inputs. And then we've got the attr binding, ATTR, for any attribute. This is great for things that don't fall into the other bindings there. Like, let's say there's an attribute for a source on an image. There is no source binding, so you can just use the attribute one and then use that to actually bind up to an image. So let's take a look at how that one works. And flipping over to the desktop. We have a built-in bindings demo, which has a whole slew of built-in bindings in one page. So here we can see the text binding over on the left, and that's showing a span. We have an HTML binding, which is great if you have details like this guy here. We're showing actual values of HTML inside the JSON object, and those values get bound up and displayed in the target element right here. So you can bind HTML instead of just text. You've got a value, and I can change the value, and then you can see the source model there, so I can change that, and it changes over here. So we can change that to like a 914C. I can change here the sales price to, let's say, $777. When I change checked, you notice over here it's turning to false. Turn it on and off. I've got radio buttons too, like brown, blue. It's changing over here. I can select a single drop-down. I can do a multi-select. Notice I selected brown and black. And over here I've got both selections. Here's the enable and the disable. You can see this one here is a little more just the negative. Getting a little more interactive because it has focus as well. So right now, when I'm in the text box, I'm saying here that the text box has focus. When I click on the button, set the focus to the checkbox is focused. And as I tab through them, you can see the button has focus, text box, the checkbox. So you can actually use this has focus binding to move the cursor to a specific place, which is kind of handy for users, especially data-intensive ones. Unique name is nice for ASP.NET controls where you need a unique name. The click is nice. Let's put a value in here like John Papa. We display the value, and we can see the user entered is John Papa. And over there, there's the input. And then down here, the event. I'm actually wiring up to the mouse over event. And when I do that, I'm using a visible binding to show that the details are visible. And when I click on this checkbox, it's going to show this value using the visible binding, or check it off. Here I'm using CSS to say when the profit is less than 0, make it use the negative class. When it's positive, we're going to use the positive class. So I'll change the value to 55, and notice it turns green. And here I'm doing the same thing, I'm just using a style. And here's the attribute for a link and both for an image. So we look at how some of these work. When we get down to the code, let's go down and look at the mouse over. Here's a data bind where I'm saying set the text to be the model's code. And looking at our demo, that is right here. The code is Taylor 314CE. And flipping back, the event is when you mouse over, call show details. And you mouse out, call hide details. So we go and look for where show details defined. It's a function that's actually setting a property called details are visible to true. Hide details sets details are visible to false. So let's see what that one's doing. Details are visible is just an observable, which is by default is set to false. And if we look where it's used, it's actually bound to the span down here where the text is showing up for details are visible. And it's showing down here, details are visible set to the visible property. So what this is in effect doing is in here, we're showing the model's code. And the event from mouse over, we're going to show the details. That's going to change details are visible to true. This becomes true. The observability will then notify the UI, hey, this value is now true. It's bound to this visible binding, which says now show this div, which has a yellow background and also binds the model's name and price. The end effect is, for a lot of words, we just hover over here and we can show an area. Pretty easy to do. Cool. So let's look back at the demo. So a couple other things to take a look at in here, and then I'll wrap up with some questions. So when you're dealing with using Knockout, I think this section you're supposed to be the templates. You also want to deal with templating because a lot of times you'll have repeated content that you need to show quite often. Now there's 4 constructs that can help you with templating and looping. One of them is the if, another one's an if not, which again, frankly, I very rarely use the if not. It's just a negative version of the if. So you can check for a truthy condition with the if, and you can also use the exclamation, the bang, to do a negative on it. You can loop through items with a for each, and the with is like a shortcut to do both an if and a data context change. This is very helpful where you use like the with on something like an address subobject. So instead of saying like customer.address.city, you could actually say with customer.address, and then inside of that with block, you can just say city, street, zip code, state, postal code, country, which is very handy. And it also does an if statement, because when you use a with, if that object doesn't have a value, a truthy value, it will skip over and not display it. So how do you use these for? With the for each, you can pass to it an object. So over here we get the lines being passed. These are order lines, for example. And then we're passing it to a template called products template. And here's my template down here. So we're saying pass the lines property and loop through it if it's an array. And for each line, there's going to be a quantity. And here we're saying display the value of quantity. Now, if you want to do conditional control flow, you can say data bind if the line's length is greater than 0. And in fact, I could just say if lines in this case, because that would be truthy as well. If the line's length is greater than 0, go ahead and display grand total. And then the with statement is very cool. So here I've got like a model that has a brand, and a model has a name. I don't want to actually display model twice. So what I can do instead is say, I don't even want this entire div to show. If there's no model, this div will not show the contents of it. And then if there is a model, it's going to say, all right, I don't need to say model.brand, I'm going to say brand or name. And it just changes the data context for that one section, which is very handy. So let's skip to the next one, and we'll do both demos at the same time, because the next one's all about templates as well. So another way you can do templates is to not do templates inside your data mining attributes. You can actually use containerless templates, containerless control flow. This is really nice for a couple of reasons. One, it takes the templating out of your HTML, so it separates it a little bit from your HTML. It uses a comment syntax, so quite frankly, in something like Visual Studio, it shows the nice color coding so you can see it. And it doesn't put them inside a script tag. And if you've ever done templating, one thing I don't like about templates is by sticking them in a script tag, a lot of the modern IDEs, like Visual Studio, they just show all the content inside the script tag as black text. You don't get your color coding, you don't get your syntax highlighting, and you certainly don't get your IntelliSense. So by using the containerless containerless control flow bindings, you get a little bit better out of that. So it's like having a template without a template. And it works with all 5 of these control flow syntax icons. And it's built into Knockout. So one example here, I'll go back, is the width. Instead of doing a div just to contain the width, because you really didn't need that div, we just wanted to put these inside of some kind of container. Now we say is create an HTML content, use the KO keyword, and it looks for the keyword width. It says this width, the selected person. If it exists, go ahead and run this code inside of here, set up this HTML, do these bindings, and change the context to select a person. The for each works nicely too, and this is really handy because in this kind of a case where you've got an LI, you may want one LI to not be in the loop. So normally, if you created like an LI and you loop through the items in the UL, you'd have to include everything inside of that for each. By actually using containerless stuff, you can now create the loop only to loop through all the items in the acoustic products, but you can still add like a category or a header by creating your own LI outside of that loop. So the for each is really nice in that case. All right, so let's take a look at that demo. Actually, look at both demos. So this one here is going to show a basic template, and let's run it in the browser. What we're doing is we're showing all these items here on the left, and when I click on all products, we're going to show them all. When I click on a particular guitar, we're going to show the details, and this is using a template over here on the right-hand side. As I toggle through different guitars, you're going to see different ones. What's actually happening here is I'm running templates. So in my code, we can come down and we can see, if I get my little plus signs in Visual Studio, which don't seem to be coming in. Okay, so here's the template. What we're showing here is inside this template for the data binding, saying for every product to show, that's an array of products, we're going to loop through these items. I've also got these two here. I'll explain those in just a moment. But first, just know we're running a template, and there's no name for the template because the template's actually in line. We're actually putting the template right in line. I don't have to use a script tag. I'm saying go ahead and iterate through here and use the CSS binding, apply the selected property, the selected class name, if the isSelected is true, and then use the div, data bind its text value to short description, and use the click binding to bind to the root's select product function. Now this root is a special reserved keyword in Knockout that says go back to the root of my view model and find the property called select product. In this case, I need to do that because right now, if I call select product, the context is an individual product because I'm using the products to show. But if I go ahead and do root, it's going to go back and find the root of my view model. So to better explain that, I'll go show you where products to show is in my view model. I think it's in another file. There we go. So we look for products to show. And here's my products to show. That's right in the root of my view model up here. So you can see view model has products to show. Well, when I'm inside of there, I'm actually in an individual product, and I don't have this thing called select a product or show products. So to get back to show products, what I have to do is I have to get out of the individual product and come back to the root. So it's kind of like doing an ancestor relative source binding with Silverlight. What you're actually doing is saying, I'm inside of the nested template, jump back out to the root. You can also do parent to get out there as well. So that's how the for each works. You can also bind up, what do you want to do after you add? After I add an item, I want to show the products, and before I remove it, I want to hide them. So what that's doing is I got a little bit of code in here. So before I add and before I remove them, right there, we're actually doing a little bit of a slide in and a slide out. We can see here the if syntax. We're saying if is select the product, then I'm going to show the products area. This entire div is not going to show unless somebody selected a product. So for example, if I refresh this page, no product is now selected, so this area over here is not being shown. When I select a product, that if gets called and all the information is being shown over here. That's when this guy gets shown. And then down inside of it, I can also do if we're showing the details or if not. And that's if I'm checking that box. There's a checkbox called show details. When I check the box, it's going to show the details. And then it's going to do this with, and it's going to show more information, like the URL for the image. So here, just by clicking that, there's no code that's actually running. It's just I'm showing a different template based upon what the value of this checkbox is. So that's kind of cool. The containerless bindings, this example looks very similarly. It looks the same here, but the difference is instead of using inline templates, what I'm actually doing, if I, oops, I'm on the wrong page. If I scroll down, instead of using inline templates, I'm using this KO containerless binding syntax. So here you can see all my code is using syntax highlighting. I get my IntelliSense, and then all my data syntax for Knockout is being highlighted in green. And I've got a Knockout block here and then there. I've got my select a product. I've got my show details, and it all works great. It's just one other way that you can use Knockout. So the last demo I wanted to show was, actually two more demos. I want to show how you can use Knockout with custom bindings. With our PowerPoint to catch up to me. So sometimes with Knockout, what you're getting out of the box isn't going to give you everything you need, so you need to write your own bindings. For example, you want to integrate with jQuery UI. Well, jQuery UI, to invoke a lot of things like create a button, you actually have to run JavaScript. So it's not just the CSS class you're applying. So how do you make Knockout's JavaScript work with jQuery UI's Knockout JavaScript? What you can do is create a custom binding. A simpler version is, let's say you just want to make things fade in and out. You can use this fade visible binding. And I'll show you how to create that. Or you can create like a custom HTML and CSS based upon a binding. I created one called star rating inside my course. Where you get like a rating star. The syntax is to create your own binding. So in here we've got binding handlers.fadeVisible. I'm defining fade visible to be a binding type. So it'll be one just like text or value or click. And the init function fires off the first time the binding is evaluated. The update will fire off every time one of the observables changes. So that's the actions you're going to take for your binding. And inside of yours, like here's the fade visible code, the element property is the bound element in the DOM. So whatever you're binding to, like a div or a button, that's going to be that element. And you can just use jQuery to get to it. The value accessor, that property is what's being passed to the binding. So that's the value that you can get to. So here we've got the actual value accessor, like the observable. And then you can also get to all of the value accessors, all the bindings, if you need to. I don't use this one as often, but sometimes I do. And then if you want, you can get to the view model itself. And there's actually a couple others too. But basically showing you what we're doing in the syntax, saying when we initialize the fade visible, we're going to get the value that we're bound to. And if the value is true, we're going to toggle that element using the toggle function with jQuery. It's going to toggle it to true to fade to display. That's the initial state. There'll be no timing, no easing. And then update, whenever the element value changes, if the element changes the value, what we're going to do is say, all right, take the element and fade in, or take the element and fade out. And it's going to use the standard default fade in, fade out timings. And you can pass in a timing here if you want to. Let's take a look at custom binding handler. All right, so down here, we've got here's the binding handler, fade visible. This is slightly different than the syntax I showed in the slide, but init is still the same, but the difference down here is I added a duration. So in this binding, when it updates, I'm going to get the value from the value accessor, that's the should display, and then I'm going to go get the all bindings. So here, I'm not just going to get the value that I'm binding to do the fade visible. I'm going to say, go get a binding. And now if there's a binding called fade duration, if somebody defines fade duration, I'm going to get that value and use that to fade in and fade out by milliseconds. If nobody passes fade duration, I'm going to use 500 milliseconds as my default. And the way you apply this inside your HTML is down here, I have a data bind for this div. I'm going to fade visible based upon if someone's showing the details or not. If somebody's showing the details, I want it to fade visible. If this is false, it's going to fade out. And I'm specifying fade duration to be 2 seconds. So we can do that, and we can run this. Now when I click over here, that binding is going to be triggered because it's going to have a value of true. I've selected an item. When I select the item, the fade visible is going to fade in. So you can see over a course of 2 seconds, if it works, hopefully, over the video. And then when I click on this box over here, it should fade out over 2 seconds. So we can see we get a nice little fade in and fade out. And I don't recommend using 2 seconds, but in the demo it kind of works. And if I get rid of the fade duration completely, and I rerun this demo, now we can see the fade in and the fade out is much quicker. It's more of a half second. Not too bad. So you can write your bindings pretty easily doing something like that. I get questions a lot on Knockout for, does this work on like iPads and other syntax too? So I wanted to show here, using a product called Electric Mobile Simulator. It's actually part of the Electric Plum products. It's a really cool product which allows you to simulate iPads and iPhones or mobile devices. So here's the same demo as you're seeing now, but you're seeing it on an iPad. And you can see here, it works just as good. And you can change the orientation. So all this Knockout code works on the iPad too. Or you can work it up on an iPhone, which I haven't really tested on this, but we can try it. There it is. Fits down below. So even though my app is not written using media queries, it works over here as well. So you can see using a product like this that you can see pretty easily that you can write Knockout, and it's just JavaScript. It works on these different devices. There's nothing special you have to do, although I do highly recommend you using kind of a media query if you're going to run this. So let's flip back over to the content. So what was all this? This was a whirlwind tour of using Knockout. And when you use Knockout, there's quite a bit that you can do. And I didn't cover everything. Like there's subscriptions you can do. There's custom bindings you can write that make it pretty easy with like things like stars and jQuery UI. There's a lot of other stuff you can do as well. But my goal today was just to kind of show you a glimpse of all the different kinds of features that you get with Knockout and kind of inspire you to do some different things. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, if you want access to these demos They'll be online with the .NET user group. I'll give these to Brian so you can post them. If you want all the demos, I've actually got over 40 demos up on the Pluralsight course that I have, and that's the title of that course that's up there. If you guys have any questions, I think I finished right on time. I was hoping to leave 10 minutes for that. I'd be happy to take some either through the chat window or if Brian wants to moderate, that's fine too. So,
Sure. There's 8 questions in here at the moment.
okay, I can start with the ones on the list here. What kind of Visual Studio 2010 project are you using for the demos? Good question. In this case, my project happens to be a regular empty web application. So I didn't use MVC or anything like that on purpose for a lot of these demos, especially in the course, because I wanted to demonstrate that you don't have to use ASP.NET Web Forms or MVC or anything like that. In fact, you could use Apache or anything else. It doesn't really matter what your server context is. However, a lot of people are using it with MVC now, and there's absolutely nothing wrong to doing with that too. Question, I normally use Firebug to debug in the browser. What debugger am I using? I was using Chrome as the browser, and I was using the Chrome built-in debugger to do my debugging. I happen to like that. I use Firebug as well with Firefox, and I also use the IE ones. How's the IntelliSense support as you start with Knockout? That's a good question. So there's 2 ways you can get IntelliSense with Knockout in JavaScript. The way I prefer is I actually run the plugin called ReSharper, and ReSharper by default is going to automatically find all the libraries for you that you're referencing, and it will give you the IntelliSense. There's a couple other ways too you can use, and Scott Guthrie put up on his blog a couple samples. ASP.NET supports a couple ways, like including the VS.doc file that you can do, or actually you can just do like a / to the name of the file. I prefer ReSharper, it's just a little more built in. But if you don't use ReSharper, because it is a paid tool, you can just use the VS.doc file. Is Knockout, yeah, there you go. Is Knockout going to ship along with VS11? I doubt it. Knockout is an open source project. Steve Sanderson, who happens to be the owner and creator of Knockout, happens to work at Microsoft, but he created that before he came to Microsoft. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I would lean heavily towards the side of it's going to stay open source. Microsoft may or may not use it. You'll notice recently that with VS11, there's actually some project templates that include Knockout in it, the single-page applications, or the SPAs, as I like to call them. And if you're a zealot, a SPA, you can call yourself a SPAS, nice little nickname. Those include using Knockout, but those are all experimental, and VS11 isn't out yet, so who knows what will happen. Can you use Knockout unobtrusively? Absolutely. So you could, instead of using the data bind attribute, you could actually set up those attributes in JavaScript and then link them up to your HTML using jQuery. There's actually a plugin coming out, and I forget the name of it, but it allows you to do Knockout unobtrusively. I could find that, though, and get that to Brian. What road path is for jQuery templates, and has the jQuery team officially abandoned it? I don't want to say the wrong thing here, because there's a great post up on Boris Moore's blog, on the jQuery UI blog, about jQuery templates. BorisMoore.com is where you can go look at that. But Boris is the creator of jQuery templates, and his new version is called JS Render, which a beta candidate just came out last week on, and it's really, really fast and much more performant. The jQuery UI team basically is not going to go with jQuery templates anymore. They may go with JS Render, but I highly recommend anybody interested in templating to take a look at JS Render. It's really fantastic. And you can check that out at BorisMoore.com. And I'm actually writing a course on that for Pluralsight, which should be out in about a month. Do I have experience using Knockout with Dojo? No, I don't. I've used Dojo, I've used Knockout, but I have not used them together, so I can't really tell you what will happen there. Why Knockout binding doesn't support indexing? I'm not sure why it doesn't. We have to ask Steve on that. And actually, Knockout's got a nice form that you can poke in there. What care should be taken in order to make the view model testable using QUnit? It's actually pretty easy to do. I use QUnit a lot. It's a pretty simple unit testing library. And you can set up your test for view models. What I try to do is I use the revealing module pattern for my tests and, for my view models. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to expose just the methods and properties that you want to make public outside your objects, and then you can just test those objects with your QUnit tests. Is KnockoutJS can use other tech like Java? Yeah, anything on the server. It's just a client-side technology. It's just JavaScript. So KnockoutJS can be used with any server-side technology. How is Knockout helping the devs structure the HTML and JS? I mean, how happy are you browsing the massive code? So that's a good question. This is where people get, you got to figure out how far do you want to fall on the scale of unobtrusive JavaScript. If you purely don't want any code whatsoever, meaning no template syntax, no data dash bind, nothing inside your HTML at all, then you probably want to take a look at the Knockout Unobtrusive JavaScript plugin. And again, I forget the exact name of it, but there is one out there. And if you go to the forums of Knockout, you can see it. It doesn't bother me to see the data dash bind syntax, and it doesn't bother me to see like a for each or a simple if. What bothers me is when you see logic, like really complex logic in the if, where people are doing, multi-ands and ors and a lot of other stuff inside there. Or they're running function inside of their data bind. That would bother me. But doing something like I showed here in the demos where it's just simple, loop through the list of products. Or if the product exists, do this. That doesn't bother me. But again, you got to figure out how far do you fall on that scale. If a developer had access to both Knockout's click event handler and jQuery in a project, would he ever mix and match them? I would hope not. I would probably stick with one or the other. And actually in my demos in the course, I show both ways to do it for a click. Some people like to do the click, and I'm actually okay with that instead of using knockouts, because one nice thing is you're really taking the advantage of the jQuery's on method in the API. You can actually just write all your event handling through the jQuery API and then bind them to a viewModels method, but not use the knockout data dash bind syntax. That still follows the viewModels structure for MVVM, so I kind of like that. Let's see here. Cool. Somebody likes Pluralsight. Like it. Are there any methods to present? Are there any methods present in KO to remove event handlers or any other unassociated bindings when swapping content in and out for SPAs? Yeah, you can. It gets a little more involved to show that, so I didn't get into those. But you can actually remove event handlers. You can actually subscribe or unsubscribe to bindings too, and that is in my course. Can you name more than one viewModel bound in a single page? Yes, you can. So like you could have multiple divs. Let's say you have 4 divs in a dashboard. You could do is you could create 4 different viewModels and the apply bindings as an overloaded operator where you can pass in the div by ID, for example, and then the viewModel you want to associate with it. Or you could create like a master viewModel and just do one binding to the whole page, and then each individual div could just use a with block to change what it's bound to. But here's another question. If you're creating a single page app, can you unload or release a viewModel after apply bindings on it? Or is it live for the duration? You can turn off Knockout when you're done, but you don't see it done that often. So I'd more ask, what are you trying to accomplish by that before you went that route? Because some people go on that route and usually you can solve it another way. Also, any suggestions on using Knockout when loading templates from separate files? Yes, actually I've got an example of that in my course. Basically there's a really, really cool plugin by a guy named Jim Cowart. He works for Append2, I believe, the jQuery UI company, the jQuery company. And what he's done is he's created an external plugin called the Knockout External Template Engine. I convinced him to make a NuGet package out of it. So if you search for Knockout and NuGet, you'll find it. And it's really simple. It's dead simple to basically link in an external template, which it uses Ajax to go get the template and pull it in for you. And I use that all the time. It's one of my favorite plugins. How does Knockout compare to Kendo UI? Okay, so Knockout is a MVVM presentation structure that helps that pattern with data binding. Kendo UI does do MVVM, but not as much as Knockout. It also does UI, kind of like jQuery UI. So I kind of think of Kendo UI, which is based by Telerik, as a product that allows you to do both MVVM and jQuery UI together. It does all that stuff. So far, Kendo UI is a little newer. I like what it does, but I'm not sold on it yet. Really smart guys there, though, and I do like what they're doing, so I expect a lot of good things from there. Would I mix the two right now? Not sure. Not sure. I've tried it, and a lot of times you have to write custom binding handlers to make Kendo UI work with Knockout. Are there any good demo projects showing how to use Knockout in Visual Studio? I think I just showed one. I'm not sure if there's a specific question you mean, but let me know. But you can pull Knockout in, yes. Can Knockout be used with any JS library? I hate to say any, because I'm sure some library out there will conflict with it, because there's millions of them. But I'm using Knockout with a lot of stuff. Like, for example, I just wrote some projects using Knockout with jQuery UI and Bootstrap from Twitter, and the Google Prettifier, and I had Sammy, which is a routing library, and they all work great with it. Coming from Silverlight, what things as a developer do we need to know to look at for learning Knockout? Actually, coming from Silverlight, I think Knockout's easier to learn than if you didn't come from a XAML background, because you've got a lot of comparisons. You've got your observables, just like you had with Silverlight. You've got your INotify property change, which is basically your observables and your observable arrays with Knockout. You've got your computeds, which is kind of like creating a calculated variable over an MVVM. You can even do things like converters and behaviors with computeds and custom binding handlers. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do there. If there's something specifically you're looking for, let me know. A couple questions left. How can we prevent Knockout to conflict with other libraries or global variables? Okay, so a great thing I like to do, and you probably noticed in a lot of my examples, what I had up there, and I can actually flip over to one real quick. What I had up in a lot of my examples, if I can find live meeting, there it is. Inside this code here, you'll notice that all of my properties for my objects are using a global namespace called my. So here I've got my view model defined as my.viewModel. My is basically a global variable I'm using for my app. And what that does is it basically pulls everything out of the global namespace that I'm using. So my view model variable, my product, my category, all those kind of things are not going to be inside the global namespace, so I don't have any conflicts to worry about, which is pretty cool. And I lost the chat window. Let's see that. Here we go. So I do that quite a bit. And then I also wrap things up inside what I call the revealing module pattern. So here I've got a function for my view model. And ignore the metadata, but I've got all my properties like product and closed details and my methods in there. All of these are private. And then at the end, I say return a list of my variables based on my properties and my methods that I want to expose publicly. This is a really nice pattern that basically, if you're familiar with .NET, it allows you to create an object in JavaScript where only these 7 properties and methods are going to be accessible. So then I can just say my.viewModel, and therefore none of my property names are going to conflict with the global namespace. So another question is, how do you mark records as deleted when you try to push deletes to a database? Or what you call a separate task when a record is removed. So that really depends on what you want to do there. Would you use any framework as part of the question? On the server, yeah, absolutely. Basically, I would remove the item if I really wanted to delete it, not a soft delete. If I really wanted to delete it, I'd remove the item from the observable array, and then I'd kind of just pass down some kind of a flag to my server side and let it know that that item was deleted. Or I would do a soft delete and like set a flag inside my array, don't show the ones that are marked as soft delete, and then pass that down to my server object through a service, and then the service can just look and see what's been deleted. Honestly, that's for something like a combination of Knockout and Upshot, which is another library that's actually pre-beta. Upshot is alpha, so I'm not using it too much right now, and it's still in flux, but that's going to do a lot of that kind of stuff for you. Do I think Knockout is a security risk? The clients are able to read the whole view model data. And what do you think about Backbone versus Knockout? I prefer Knockout versus Backbone, honestly, although Backbone, they kind of overlap, but they do different things. I'll let you kind of decide there. Do I think it's a security risk showing over JavaScript? No, I don't. You're not showing anything you wouldn't have normally with methods and properties in there. But if there was something you wanted to hide, yeah, obviously you don't want to show that. Where can I find the demos you showed? You will find those up on the website for LIDNUG, I assume. Brian will take care of putting those up there for you. I have some posted on my blog already too, so I'll probably repost those. When using ASP.NET MVC with HTML helpers, such as the Razor syntax, what's the best way to inject Knockout data bindings? That's probably a longer discussion we have time for here, but you can basically interact between using server-side Razor with Knockout. Some good examples are up there on Steve Sanderson's website, KnockoutJS.com, which you can look for. Can you use Knockout with partial views as templates? Kind of. So if you mean, can I use a server-side partial view with Knockout? You could, but I'm not sure if you have the desired effect you want. You probably want to use Knockout's built-in templating if you truly want to do client-side templating, or you want to use like jQuery templates or maybe JS render or underscore. Can I do a quick comparison to Backbone.js? Probably not too quick of a one. I know Backbone doesn't do nearly as much on the client as Knockout does for a lot of the bindings and the wiring up, but Backbone does do more for that passing data back and forth and wiring up to your web services for you. So it kind of depends on what are you trying to focus on. If If you're focusing on the MVVM pattern and the data binding, Knockout's probably a better choice. Backbone's a little more for the wiring up with the services and dealing with the hooking into things. Okay, not to open Pandora's box, somebody had asked this, but at the current rate of pilfering of all the best features of WPF Silverlight, is there going to be any reason left to use them? Sure. Actually, some of the companies I'm working with are still developing new apps with WPF and Silverlight because they happen to solve problems better today than HTML and CSS do. And it's not like those things are going away. They're going to be around. Maybe the new features aren't coming out as fast as we had been seeing them come out, but even if none of the features come out, then you still have a good development platform. For example, if you're developing a kiosk application or you want to interact with hardware, like a touch device, where it's got like a card reader in it, you probably would need something like WPF. But if you're not needing something that WPF Silverlight does, and you want to hit all these different kind of devices like iPads and whatnot, then HTML and JavaScript and CSS are great. Someone's asking if I can comment on Knockback, which combines both Knockout and Backbone together. I know of it, but I have not used it, so I can't really tell you if it's good or bad. And I named 2 websites using KnockoutJS. Is it heavily adopted? A lot of the sites I know using Knockout that are for companies are ones that I can't alert you to, but I know they're out there. Is it heavily adopted? Actually, it's pretty well adopted out there. And it's not like adopted like jQuery is, where half the websites in the world are using it, obviously. Nothing's like that but jQuery. But it is growing very fast, and there's a lot of support for it. One of the nice things, you go to stackoverflow.com or the chat groups on KnockoutJS, there's a lot of activity in there. And actually, Steve Sanderson has some really good content up on his site, too, for tutorials that you can look at. And you can also point out to the Pluralsight videos that were also linked up to his site. So you can get to my Pluralsight videos from KnockoutJS.com, or you can get to the tutorials that he's written. Second to last question. About to have a team start using Knockout and JS heavily. Any recommendations or removes and possible frustrations? Other than a tell sense of any ways to syntax code check and gain good traction. One of the best things to do is to use your tools like ReSharper to help you with this. Another one is whenever I use Knockout, I really recommend doing some patterns like dealing with creating your objects as functions using the module pattern or the revealing module pattern. I would check into both of those, see which one is right for you, while you can create objects using object literals. It gets a little more harder to maintain once your objects get a little more complex. Another thing is I would choose your UI wisely there too. Like if you're using Knockout, do you want to use jQuery UI with it? If so, that's great. If you want to use Kendo UI, that's cool. Probably a little more frustrating using Kendo with Knockout right now than jQuery UI, which seems to be a little simpler. I'm actually lately been using Bootstrap with Knockout for the UI stuff, and it's been really, really helpful. Does it make sense to use Knockout with ASP.NET Web API? Absolutely. Actually, I'm writing a course on that too, on how to use Knockout with the Web API. That's with MVC4. And last one, congrats on a great presentation. Thank you. Cool, appreciate it. I don't know how many questions we answered, but it seemed like quite a bit in there. I think we're out of time, a few minutes over. If anybody has any other questions, I will be available on Twitter. You can always come contact me there. And I'll put up my Twitter address real quick. Most people are still on here. Let's see. So you can contact me on Twitter. It's the best way to get a hold of me, or go to my website. And my Twitter handle is @John_Papa. Don't go to John Papa. That's another guy. It's a photographer, actually, in Canada. But I check Twitter. I check Twitter quite a bit. There's a tongue twister. So if you want to reach out for any questions, you can ask me there. And I'm thinking about doing a follow-up course with Knockout probably in 2 to 3 months, which will hook in Knockout with some tips and tricks and use MVC4's new features like the Web API and the bundling and the minification, and probably use Bootstrap in there as well with for the UI, and I'll probably use Sammy for the routing, so I can do some kind of SBA kind of magic there. So look out for that. But my next course right now, which is coming up soon, is the JS Render course. Other than that, if anybody has any other questions, please contact me on Twitter, and I'll hand the floor back over to the LIDNUG guys.
Fantastic. John, thank you very, very much for that. It's not quite a bit more than I expected in the hour that we had here today. Definitely things that open my eyes that I need to look into to Knockout a bit more. As said also that we have a few giveaways. I have found some people. I'm going to double check that these people are LIDNUG members. If they are, then I shall certainly be sending them an email with their Pluralsight subscriptions.
And yes, I have a 1 week and a 1 month subscription that you can give away as well.
Fantastic. So a total of 1 week and 3 1 month subscriptions will be given away. And I shall send them an email to the winners within the next 24 hours. Let's see here. The winners are Monica Ahuya, Brian Harton, Andrew Super, and Robert Carlson. Thank you very much, guys. You will be receiving an email including the registration code and redemption code for Pluralsight. That's it. Thank you very much, guys.